Thank you very much for coming today. Despite the excellent weather, it's really picking up now, the spring weather, so I'm very glad we could convince you to come here into a lecture room. I'm delighted for today we have the 17th Dementia Open Forum, which is really happening since 2016, so it's really picking up, which is fantastic. Just to start with some housekeeping, there are no fire drills planned, so if there's a fire alarm, please make your way out either on this staircase or there's another staircase, all the way downstairs and out of the building. There are no designated assembly places for this building, unfortunately, so just remove yourself from the building as much as you can. Toilets, if you go out of this side and turn right, I have to think myself, then you will find the toilets. My spatial disorientation, which comes always. And so I'm really delighted today to introduce Professor Fiona Poland, who's a professor of social methodology research, and Linda Birt, who's a senior research associate. And very often in these dementia forums, we talk very about biomedical issues in terms of the disease, how it's caused, and what factors affecting it. But Fiona and Linda in particular will focus much more on the social aspect and social inclusion. And so I'm really delighted to have you here. So over to you. There will be plenty of time later to ask any questions. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michael. And as Michael said, thanks so much, everybody, for actually coming and taking part of your pre-Easter weekend to share this with us. What we're very pleased to be able to do is to share findings from a very large study which is about promoting independence in dementia. And it was designed to explore causes of reducing mental abilities or cognitive decline. So there is actually, if you like, a disease illness part of the big study. But the part that we were concentrating on was about the experience of living with cognitive decline and dementia. And the overall study was aimed at developing a social intervention to help people with dementia living at home to stay more independent. And so today we're going to share results from our qualitative and interview and observation study, which was led from UEA. And who did we talk to? We talked to older people interested in memory, people with mild cognitive impairment, and then people with diagnosed mild to moderate dementia, and also family carers. And we were particularly interested in social participation. So how do we keep people, and what does it mean for people to stay being involved in their social lives? And then how do changes in cognitive skills affect how people interact with each other? So in the next 40 minutes, Linda and I are going to report a part of our results, and we're going to look at the structures, the social structures and relationships which enable a person with dementia to remain socially connected, and how those social connections can impact on their sense of self. So first puzzle, what do we mean by self? And and what we want to really emphasise is how a person themselves presents their essential being, right? What is it that sets the self that I recognise apart from other selves? And that can be through our work, our hobbies, our friendships, and our family. And what can happen is a diagnosis of dementia can wipe away those essential components, or in terms of people's relationships, be seen to be wiped away. Then the person becomes known not for those other things, but becomes known simply for their dementia. In fact, a person, a case of dementia. Yeah? So in this presentation, what we want to do is to mainly report the experience of people who have a dementia diagnosis, but using their words and actions to portray their experiences. And we do recognise that there are usually others, spouse, family, friends, who support the person with dementia and who experience living with dementia in distinctly different and more challenging ways. So we acknowledge this and will report elsewhere, but not today, the experiences of the 21 family carers that we interviewed, but their carer's voice is reduced in this presentation, where we'll be focusing on the voice of the person with dementia. And there will be time for discussion and questions at the end.
Thank you. So I'm going to very quickly set the context of the work that we did. So a little bit of background about the PRIDE study, which Fiona's touched upon. It was a very large programme grant, so it covered 5 years of work across a number of universities. So collaboration is key in most of the research that we do. And as Fiona said, we were looking at ways to help people with dementia take control of their lives, remain independent, and remain valued and valuable. And here at UEA, we undertook the Talking About Memory study, which I know some people in the audience have been involved in, either as participants or co-researchers. And we talked across a range of different people about what memory meant to people, what the word dementia meant to people, and for those living with dementia, how it was impacting on their life and the types of support that they drew on. It was a longitudinal study, so over 12 to 15 months. We started and we did a first interview with people, and at that stage we recruited 124 people. And then after 12 to 15 months, we went back and did a second interview to find out how life was changing, what was happening as the dementia progressed or as people got older. We recruited across England, so we had somebody in Hull and Nottingham, London and Norfolk as well, just to get a regional variation. And the data that we're sharing today comes from the interviews that we did, from a literature review that we did at the beginning of the study in order to set the context, and also from observations. And I undertook the majority of the interviews and all the observations within the study. And just a little bit of background. We were very lucky that we were able to recruit some of the oldest old people. So 18 people within our sample were over 85 years of age, and 51 people were living with a diagnosis of dementia. So dementia disrupts social connections. What does that mean? When we carried out the literature review and from our previous sort of practical experience, we understood that the diagnosis is not just a biomedical event. It's not just a label. It affects all the relationships that are going on in your life, and it can create a hiatus. People enter a period of liminality, between and betwixt. What am I now? What does this label mean to me? And when we were looking at the literature, this very much came up across published studies from both the UK and continental studies and wider across the world. So the whole process of getting diagnosis is a ritual. There's a whole number of steps and stages that people go through to enter into this liminal state. And what we found was that very much cultural factors, social factors, personal resilience all impacted on how people coped with the diagnosis. So some people moved into living in the shadow of the fourth age. This is it's often used in research. It's a term about social death, loss of self, increased frailty. Very much held up as a very negative thing. But we did find that some people moved comfortably into that age of frailty, increasing interdependence. And that was the key factor, interdependence. Other people lived in extended liminality. There was ambiguity around their diagnosis. They were not accepting of their diagnosis. They became quite isolated and depressed. And most importantly, and the group that we're looking at predominantly today, are those that were managing to live well with dementia. And we found that one of the factors that seems to help people live well and maintain their connections is social capital reserve. Social capital is the relationships that you have with others. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's a lot of fear around dementia, and a lot of stigma. And whilst that's changing, it's still very much present. And Fiona's going to talk a little bit about stigma and some of the theories of stigma.
So over the years, as Linda says, researchers found that the disease and symptoms of dementia have themselves been stigmatised. That if you have those signs, that they then link to a particular label, discrediting, almost denouncing that one has this label, and that means that one is thought about in different ways, not necessarily to one's advantage. And it is known that different ethnic groups think about dementia in different ways, and that this can increase or decrease stigmatising attitudes. So the stigmatising attitudes of others, or oneself having internalised stigmatising beliefs, can then limit how far one's able to take part in what one thinks of as normal social life. So, for example, younger people with that sort of label may assume that they can no longer manage in employment. So while there's a need to use clinical terms in making a diagnosis, it's important to remember the impact of a comment which a clinician may think is reasonable, but actually we can see the language of the stigmatised brand being marked by the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So one of the things that we're really highlighting is that something that may seem to be a clinical label is also a socially meaningful label that may then carry social consequences. So although many of those that we interviewed who were living with dementia didn't see themselves as stigmatised, a minority did feel themselves to be negatively affected by their diagnosis and being branded or labelled or with fear. So understanding how people experience a diagnosis of dementia, how they perceive others thinking about them, is as important as it is because partly through the reflections of others we understand ourselves. So people are not simply passive and unconscious of what the consequences of having this label might be. And so what we make of our relations with others is called social construction. One sec, I just got lost.
So one of the things that we think about in social construction, and we're very quickly going through two of the key theories that we've drawn upon in order to situate the work, and particularly a publication that we've put in at the moment, is Sabat and Goffman, and Fiona is the expert on Goffman. It's her pride reading about stigma.
No, actually, I didn't recognize the slide isn't quite what I remembered the last time I looked at it. Yeah. Yeah, so as I was saying, that our sense of self, who we are, and what is important to us comes from within and is reflected and reinforced by others. So that is about being socially constructed. Now, Sabat's work acknowledged this, and Sabat identified 3 variations of self. So self 1 is the singular personal self, I am. I have a good memory. My strength is kindness. And self 2 is about what I'm known for. So physical appearance, my beliefs, my emotional attitudes. So am I a quick-tempered person? Am I a noisy person, a kind person? And self 3 are the kinds of behaviours expected in one's role. So volunteers, an employee, spouse, and behaviours. So if we occupy a role, are we actually able to competently, acceptably perform the roles that people expect of us? Yeah. So we know others have got a part to play in supporting the continued self of the person with dementia in these various aspects. Now, Goffman argues that stigma takes place. So how does this stigma happen? When a person has an attribute which becomes discredited by others, right? And then this attribution leads to rejection from society more widely, but maybe from one social group. And stigma could be a physical mark, or, as is common in dementia, being known as part of a stigmatised group. And that means people with dementia in that group may be discredited because of the disease, right? Because of having the label of the disease. Now, what we underline is that people don't just simply accept that, and people with dementia don't simply then become passive to these processes happening. People stay active. We can see that individuals themselves take action to manage the impression that they're giving. And Goffman talks about the performances that people do to hide stigmatising attributes. So perhaps here this might mean not disclosing a diagnosis or using strategies to avoid being seen in public, to forget. And these were the kinds of things which emerged from the research.
And what we found was that really the self could be threatened if the symptoms of dementia led to others discrediting the person and calling into question their personal attributes and their stigmatising behaviours. And here we have from the literature some of the examples of how people actively worked to make themselves acceptable. We've used that word acceptable in the title, and what we mean is acceptable to the individual, not necessarily to others, but what makes me feel comfortable as I am. So managing impressions. I'm performing in whatever way I need to, but recognising the work that takes place in that, but I'm exhausted once I've done that. Performing social roles. We all perform social roles, and that doesn't stop when we have a diagnosis of any illness. And so I love coaching, volunteering, that self-3. It's my passion, but I'm not going to give up on my dream just because of my dementia diagnosis. Presenting an acceptable self. I see my friends and I enjoy going out. And the key part, I feel human. It's what most of us would want, no matter what chronic illness we might be living with. But also people within the literature were very aware of when their self might be discredited. So it's clear to me my dementia negated the things that I said. Nobody listened to me anymore because of who they perceived me to be. So we're going to move on now and look at social connections. So we have the two titles, the acceptable self and social connections. Social connections, what are they and why do they matter? A social connection happens when there's more than one person there. And generally people have a social network, a group of people that they regularly contact, whether that's in person, on social media, by telephone, by email. And that might be within the family, might be within friendships, or it might be within the wider community. And one of the things that we get from social connections is very much social capital. So social capital isn't about money, it's not about economics, it's about trust, reciprocal relationships, being able to draw on support from people. So when you perhaps volunteer or build up a friendship or help somebody out with a cake, then you've built social capital. And when you're in need of something, you can draw on your social capital. And so this was an idea that we were starting to think about. And what we've done in the literature, what we've done in our research rather, is look at where social capital is happening. But it's important to recognise social connections don't just happen. You don't get a network of friends. You don't lose a network of friends. You need to think about interactions. Who's leading that interaction? The person with dementia, the family carer, somebody else. Where are the interactions happening? And we're going to look at some data about places that build or close down opportunities for social connection. And social connections can be positive or negative. So the literature suggests it's not the number of networks and connections you have, it's the quality of those networks and connections that matter. in maintaining health in dementia and older age. And the literature tells us, and I know that people perhaps that are carers or live with somebody with dementia in the audience knows this, dementia can reduce your social connections. And yet this is a bit of a negative thing, because we know that loneliness increases cognitive decline. So if we're thinking about maintaining cognitive health, the more connections you have, the better it may be. We know that reduced connections and opportunities to link with people reduces your social capital, the chance of getting support. People with dementia do withdraw, and that might be because of depression, because of other illnesses, because of comorbidities, or it might be because of lack of confidence or lack of support to actually continue. Family carers report that some of the psychosocial changes in behaviour can be very burdensome, and that can reduce opportunities for the family to connect with others. And as I've said, it's the quality of the connections that matters. So in our research, 124 people that we interviewed, which 51 had dementia, we found that many people living with dementia actively take action to avoid being stigmatised. They actively maintain their social connections, and they actively work to present an acceptable social persona, to live as active citizens and not to remain in that liminal state of ambiguity. From the whole data set, it's qualitative data, so it's interviews, and we did thematic analysis, and from that we were able to draw up some of the key social factors that help people maintain social connections. Being physically able, and particularly to get out of the house. Having stable social networks in the past, so friends that don't drop away. The neighbourhood that you live in can really impact on opportunities. So here in Norfolk, the buses were a common narrative within the interviews, or the absence of the bus. Accepting and sharing a dementia diagnosis. Again, if we think about the table, you can accept the diagnosis and be prepared to share it in ways that are powerful to you, then that was found to be more beneficial than not accepting and remaining in denial. And there's some personal qualities there that need exploring a little bit more, and that might be our next study, looking at resilience. The person themselves, what type of resilience can they bring to it? And that sense of reinforcement of self, which Fiona talked about, if your interaction has been positive, you're more confident, you have the resilience to go out and interact again and build up those networks again. So for the next sort of 5-10 minutes or so, I'm going to draw on 4 specific case studies from the data. They're all people living with dementia for varying lengths of time, and they're not all in Norfolk, they're across the country from our 4 recruitment sites. So the diagrams are quite complex, but we'll go through and look at some of the data, some of the things that people said to me in the interviews. And this is a case of somebody who's able to maintain that social capital. They had an extensive, wider community network, had lived in the city for over 30 years, had a good, strong base of friends. And they shared and accepted the diagnosis. I say they, deliberately, because it was a husband and wife, and they both were together working to maintain these social connections. We've told people, and suddenly we realise we're surrounded by friends. And I know that's not the narrative that everybody has in a dementia journey, but this was what was happening to these people. The self-3, the things that the man did before, the church, the hobbies, the long-standing relationships, all were very positive as he moved through his dementia journey. So here he was a regular churchgoer, and he had told some people at church about his diagnosis, but he was a bit nervous about stepping forward and stepping up to the mark, if you like. But here a lady wasn't able to do the Bible reading, and he says, the lady wasn't able to do the reading, so I signed up to do it. I'd won competitions doing Bible readings when I was a young man. It was tremulous, but it was wonderful. that positive reinforcement, the support that he got from a group of people that knew he was struggling to do this, but he did it well. Location, where you live. He lived really close to a local supermarket. He was able to walk there every day. He had the physical ability to go outside the house. All of these were things that were positive for him. And not being afraid to ask for help, I suppose. I met an old friend. I said to him I'd forgotten his name as I have this Alzheimer's thing. I don't mind telling people because I want the help they can give. And again, as sort of researchers and practitioners, we appreciate that that's not possible for everybody to share a diagnosis. And we have a PhD student at the moment who's looking at an intervention to support people to share if and when they want to. So here you can see that the networks, the connections he had before his diagnosis were still supporting afterwards. The person he was before his diagnosis, the churchgoer, the walker, the swimmer, was still in place after his diagnosis. And I know that that's continuing on, sort of 2 years post-diagnosis. But here we have a different case study. And this is where social capital, those networks, those connections that the lady had before have started to reduce. So again, lived in the same place for quite a long while. But there was a reluctance to tell. People at the social club had started to notice that her behaviours were changing. She was forgetting things. And she said, well, we don't go there now. It's become too much. And when asked about why it was too much, it was, well, it's just difficult. I can't remember things. Her network was reducing. If my husband goes out, I go as well, because he gets to talk to different people and I get to hear what he's got to say. So there wasn't a sense of talking with people herself and building relationships and building connections. It was very much on the back seat. And partly this is due to loss of confidence as well. I don't like going out on my own. That's something I don't do. That fear, which is understandable, but perhaps as practitioners and with interventions, we can help people maintain some of that feeling of safety when they're outside the house. But no case is ever completely reduced or negative or restricted. And here we have her showing reciprocal relationships, maintaining social capital. I've got a friend and she likes walking, so nearly every other day I go for a walk with her. And here's the reciprocal part. I suppose I'm company for her, as she's company for me. The give and take in a social connection, the positive reinforcement. And as practitioners and as researchers, as we look at interventions, these are the small things that we need to be aware of to think about how we can promote and support and develop those small things in what appears otherwise to be quite a negative example of living with dementia. Those examples were drawn from the interview data, but we also did observations. And so 13 people allowed myself and my colleague in London to go out with them when they went out into the community, to clubs, to memory cafes, to sports clubs, to dancing clubs, to singing clubs, all over the place. And what you're doing in observation as a researcher is you make detailed notes about what's going on. And then when you analyse it, you're very much looking for the patterns. What's happening here that enables this to take place or stops that taking place? So these were positive examples, and I think you can see yourselves why they might be positive examples. Cognitive stimulation group, those who live with somebody with dementia or have dementia will be aware of these. And here it was very much leader-facilitated, not leader-led. There were lots of opportunity for conversation. The whole group was involved in the conversation. Church tea and chat and luncheon clubs, these were my favourite observations, needless to say. Again, opportunity for conversation, but also opportunity for non-dementia talk. And that was really key for many of the participants I talked to be able to do things that they'd done before and not just to go to a dementia cafe, to a dementia support group, to a dementia dancing group, to a dementia gardening group, to a dementia walking group. It was to go to tea and chat, because that's where my friends are. And that's where I can talk about things that were important to me, being a grandmother, a mother, my baking, my sewing. And the memory cafes were supportive as well. And a number of people attended, often with their family, spouse. But it was where there was things, where there was interaction, activities, props that helped. Same situations, but completely different experiences for social connections. So in this memory cafe, although it was set up very well to facilitate conversation, there was nobody to do the facilitation. And so therefore the person I was with dementia just sat. There was nobody to interact with, and although perhaps it wasn't my role as the researcher, I did the interaction, and we had quite a good conversation using some of the props that were there. But there wasn't anybody that was officially taking on that role. The second cognitive stimulation group was quite amazing. It was a paper-based quiz on maths, and there was to be no consultation and no shouting out of answers, and you had to write them down, and then they'd be marked at the end. Needless to say, when you get people in a group, they're dissident, so there was quite a bit of shouting out. And shopping, yes, it's a social activity, but shopping in a supermarket, very little chance of social interaction. However, going to your local shop, where you know the man behind the counter or the lady behind the counter, you can give a high five, as one of my participants did, positive reinforcement in place. So I'm going to run through 2 case studies, drawing on the observation data. So this is Fred. You'll see he's one of our oldest participants, and he lives alone. Which again, stereotypically people think, oh, people don't live alone with dementia, but he lives alone, supported by his friends. And one of the things that enables him to live alone is the fact that he's lived within a village for over 30 years, and he actively built social capital during those 30 years. Shopkeeper, built the village hall, run the gardening club, on the parish council. And when I observed him, doing one of the roles that he'd done for 30 years, which was within the church. The bell ringer, a defined role, if we think about self 3. Meeting people, constantly saying hello, but also recognising that his memory is not what it was, his cognitive ability is not what it was. And so he said to me, I won't know people's names, so you'll just have to introduce yourself, otherwise that will be quite embarrassing. So I did. And we know that routine and rituals are important in all our lives, and perhaps more so as memory declines. So he could follow the liturgy of the service. He knew the hymns. He didn't need to be able to read them. But there were little absences. So when the collection came round, he forgot it was time. But his friend stepped straight in, and it wasn't a fuss. Nobody noticed. And I've put in red here sensory loss, because this man is pretty old, 85 to 89, but maybe not. He's got dementia for 15 months, but he also was registered blind as well. And that was the thing that was of most concern to him, the fact that he couldn't see as well. He also had hard hearing, so there were big parts of the service that he missed, not because of his cognitive decline, but because of his sensory loss. And it's easy to assume, he didn't know what was going on because, he's got dementia, but it was because he couldn't hear. So if we think about what enables an acceptable self, we've got secure bases, well-known, secure relationships, places where he felt he knew what he was doing, the routines were known, objects, rituals, routines, and social capital reserve. And then this one is not so good again. This is Roger. He lives with his wife, and his network is predominantly within his family. His physical ability, he's quite frail now, has difficulty walking, and that restricts opportunity for his independence. And he just started over the last 2 to 3 weeks at a day centre, 1 day a week, partly as respite for his wife, partly as a means of trying to increase the social connections that he had. But if we start here with the limited social interaction, these are from my notes. More time passes with no engaging activity. A lone member of staff changes the songs for the rock and roll CD, and Roger taps his foot along. He's trying to engage, but there's a lack of facilitation. Other attendees are dropping off to sleep. People do not appear to know each other. Only two ladies sit next to each other, quietly chatting. The staff talk amongst themselves and not with the attendees. So that absence of facilitation, which can be really important as your dementia progresses and you can't necessarily lead the social connection, you might need somebody else to support, to facilitate, to include, to enable the social connection. It was also a difficult place for positive social connections because Roger was an occasional visitor once a week. He didn't yet know the routines, and I don't know that he would be able to remember the routines. It wasn't a place he'd gone to before. It was unclear about what was going to happen next. And that's disconcerting. It was disconcerting to me as a researcher, and it was equally disconcerting to Roger. But if we think about Goffman and presentation of self, Roger very much was still trying to manage the impression that he was giving, was still trying to connect with others. He was laughing at jokes and making jokes himself. He was recounting his personal stories to myself, attempting to recount them to the staff there. I want to put sort of a caveat on this. This is not a reflection on poor practice. This is a reflection on place and the difficulties of going to a new place. Because, you know, it was a snapshot. I was only there a couple of hours, so it's not a reflection on practice. But if we think about what hinders having an acceptable self, that insecurity, fragile relationships, you can't form positive social connections and you're flitting in and you're flitting out. They take time. And unpredictable places, that fear of not knowing, am I doing what I should do? If I do that wrong, will I be stigmatised? And the absence of the opportunity to present a social persona. And yet Roger had a strong social self 2 and self 3 at home. His arts, his crafts, he could tell you about those in great detail. He could present those as who he was. And yet that opportunity was lost in this particular place. And so, if we think about key points, Fiona will summarise in the next 3 slides for us.
So I think what Linda's graphically and I think very vividly related to us is the need to acknowledge the person, to make space for the person, not the patient, and to actually support them to manage the impression they present to others, that they want to present to others, and to have meaningful social roles, the self-3 that Linda was referring to. And if we do that, we can then find ways for people to stay independent, to have a recognisable social self that they recognise, other people can recognise, and so to have some status as a citizen, someone who can play their part with other people. So what we're saying is that we need to recognise social connections. We need to find ways to nurture and, in new situations, to establish social connections, because through others, we know ourselves. And that uncertainty that was brought out in the 2nd and 4th cases, we can actually help people to overcome. And we found that, obviously, those able to draw on long-standing, reciprocal, exchanged social connections appeared to live better with their dementia. We've done other work with people with advanced dementia, which indicates that even when people can't fully or coherently think these things, they can enjoy, they can express the positive emotions about the self that are invested in them and that they invest in themselves. And the actions of others, and again we had quite a lot of examples of these in the cases that Linda related, can actually help mask potentially stigmatising actions, like missing the moment for the collection plate to go round, and somebody else steps in and actually helps somebody to stay and perform that role. So to expand the discussion, you know, we're underlining the point that our health isn't defined merely by our social and cognitive abilities, but we also need to remain alert to social health. And I think that's something that's becoming very widely recognised now in the health agenda and health policies. And this is something that's been defined by Huber as having 3 key dimensions. So we now see that enabling and also recognising the agentic ways in which those living with a diagnosis work to maintain their social connections is important in prompting and supporting their social health. So the capacity to fulfil potential and obligations, the ability to manage life with some degree of independence, and to be able to take part in social activities. And so this moves the theory and practice on from Kitwood's work to now encourage discussions about interventions which can support social health at all stages of the dementia trajectory. So we don't want there to be a cut-off point, and we don't want labels to be stigmatising and, again, cutting off somebody's social life and status. This is an area we continue to investigate and recognise how important positive social health is, and to family carers as well as the person with dementia. And that's another paper where we'll be talking about the submersion of the carer in their particular role. So one of the things that we want to say is that taking this social lens to look at a person's life with dementia, we can see them enacting those social connections that support social, cognitive and physical health. And we want to argue that it's important, both for researchers, but anyone interacting in the lives of people with dementia, to look for the shift in how we position what we are doing to position people with dementia on a trajectory of decline, and to avoid that if we can, to take care that we do not contribute to that with our own actions and assumptions, but instead to take care to recognise and build on opportunities for social citizenship through social connections. And that's what we mean about people's social capital, being able to build on the store of ingredients that they can use to continue to build their social selves. And we would argue that using sociological theories from people like Goffman and Sabat about self and stigma, we can understand what is shaping or breaking those social connections that we see having such an impact on cognitive health. And we're...
so we have to thank our funders, which was ESRC and National Institute for Health, and these comments are ours and not theirs. And I also just want to, as we take questions, leave that up. The slides will be available, but these are some publications that are already out there that sort of build on what we've been talking about today. And thank you, and I have to take questions, discussion.
Thank you very much.